A while back, PragerU had sued Google and YouTube because they had restricted some of their content. Why am I covering this old case? Because in my opinion, throughout their own coverage of their lawsuit, they were acting within full knowledge that they were being two-faced with their audience. PragerU is telling their audience that the problem is that YouTube is acting both as a publisher and as a public forum, and that it can't be acting as both. The takeaway is that these two categories have tangible protections under the law, that publishers are only allowed to publish content made by themselves, and a platform isn't allowed to moderate content, but can't be held liable for content not made by them, and that YouTube is unlawfully breaking the law by acting as both.
It worked, and then it didn't. A few years ago, the social media giants, Google, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, started to behave not like public forums, but like publishers. They stopped following Section 230, which specifically requires that these websites promote a true diversity of political discourse, and began to judge content by their own political and social criteria. In other words, the social media giants want it both ways. They want the protections of a public forum and the editorial control of a publisher. We're fine if they're a publisher, and we're fine if they're a public forum. They just can't be both. If we win our legal action, YouTube will have to return to the way things were when they started. That's freedom. But if we lose, YouTube gets to act as a publisher while pretending to be a public forum.
It's funny that they bring up Section 230, because Section 230 case law expressly gives them the power of publishers. Thus, lawsuits seeking to hold a service provider liable for its exercise of a publisher's traditional editorial functions, such as deciding whether to publish, withdraw, postpone, or alter content, are barred. So if PragerU is trying to show that a public forum can't exercise a publisher's functions, I recommend not bringing up the one thing that has historically given them the power to do so. I'm not calling PragerU two-faced because of this misinformation in their video. I'm calling them two-faced because PragerU doesn't make this argument in their initial brief or in the hearing. That's because the argument doesn't exist as a matter of law. There is no distinction between businesses like publishers and businesses that hold public forums, and certainly not one for information providers. So why doesn't PragerU tell their audience their real argument? The reason they don't tell their audience is because of all things. PragerU is arguing that Google and YouTube should be considered state actors, i.e. the government. And for the most part, they argue this because YouTube describes themselves as a public forum, or because they hold themselves out as such. This by far is a fairly impressive low bar to be considered a state actor, but it's even made lower by PragerU's own ethics. I don't think there's ever a video where they don't champion private enterprise and praise the minimization of government intervention. Even in their video about crony capitalism, their only solution to money in politics is to reduce the size of government. For them to come back and say, well, if you label yourself as a public forum, now you cede your rights as a private entity, and now you have to act as an entity of the state. That's clearly a threat to private enterprise, but also a threat to the First Amendment. It seems like they're only for capitalism when it benefits them. Otherwise, they're fine with more government control over businesses. To get into the more juicy bits, PragerU tried to use two cases that showed their legal theory was correct: Marsh and the recent court case, Halleck. The first argument is made using Marsh, where PragerU's lawyers try to argue that YouTube's business should be considered that of a company town, if not further.
They are not just a company town. They're arguably a company country and maybe a company world force. And my point is that they did that on the express designation, which they have repeated to Congress under oath, that they are a public forum. So to Judge Baby's point, if that's all they do, I guess they get to advertise themselves, and I guess they get to run around there and consistently say, we're a public forum, we're a public forum, we're a public forum, but they don't have to abide by the fundamental principles that are at the heart of what it is to be a public forum.
But it seems to me that you can puff and say that you're a public forum, but that doesn't define your First Amendment status. I mean, they are a public forum in a colloquial sense. People can go, they host speech by a whole variety of individuals, organizations, companies, and so in that way they become a public forum for discussion. But does that necessarily mean that they're a First Amendment public forum? And that's, I think, why what you're trying to say is, well, by representing the words public forum, that they're transformed.
However, as we see from the judges, they find this argument to be stretched by the fact that YouTube isn't a company town. However, this is all moved towards the Halleck case. where the lawyer admits that the central argument from Howlick is that it only rules that hosting speech is incapable of transforming a private actor. But the lawyer attempts to get around this by the idea of titles.
How else, let me ask you this, if this were a government website, and
That would be a
That would
completely
be a
different
very,
case.
that,
but why? Because of title, right? Solely because of title.
no,
And-
not because of title, but because it would then be state action.
Well, but
Or
it's
if the
state action
government-
because of title.
Or if the government had
Because of
given
reality.
them, if this were a licensed right, that is, if there were limited band scope, and the FCC were deciding who gets band scope or not, and they gave YouTube, all of this broadband, and just let them dominate everything, and becomes the only thing, it might be a very different case.
Yeah,
that
That's
kind of
closer-
market
that's closer
dominance
to the dissent.
and government licensed.
Right. But again, I think you're drawing a line that says how else can a property owner or even the government have a public forum without designating it?
Arguing that the title should be the determining factor of when a private actor becomes a state actor. Which, as we see again from the judges, they find this argument to be laughable. This is what I mean about PragerU being two-faced. How can PragerU hold itself out to being pro-free market, and yet when a private actor who isn't even refusing to do business with them, but only plays some of their videos in restricted mode, as in it would only prevent 1.5% of users from seeing it, then PragerU decides to freak out and that YouTube should be made into a state actor. I mean, PragerU supports the idea that if a baker won't bake you a cake, find another baker. Don't demand the state tell him what to do with his private business. There are a multitude of different services like BitChute, Vimeo, and Rumble. Why not use these services instead of demanding that the state tell YouTube what to do with their private business? There's always been questions of whether anything PragerU has said is credible, but it's made even worse as PragerU is morally hypocritical and believes that their own moral standards should not apply to them, only to others. PragerU doesn't practice what they preach. Hey guys, another video here, and I haven't made a video in a while since I've been working on a Tim Pool video. And while going through his videos takes quite the period of time, well, as most of them are quite bland and repetitive, and unnecessarily long, I've decided to put that on pause for now so I can get at other content, like this. Anyways, thanks for watching.